Do you know what it feels like to be invisible?
Marcus Hayes' voice trembled as he stood in the glow of the restaurant lights, his worn hands gripping the edges of his jacket.
To walk into a room and see people look right through you like you don't even exist.
The room had fallen silent. Moments ago, Marcus had been nothing more than a shadow, a man most people ignored or avoided. But now, standing in the heart of Magnolia Haven, he was impossible to overlook. The judgmental stares, the murmured whispers, they had once been a familiar weight on his shoulders. Tonight, though, he was done carrying it.
Let me tell you something,
He continued, his voice growing stronger.
people think strength is about standing tall, about being untouchable, but real strength is surviving when the world has already given up on you.
His words cut through the tension like a blade, and for the first time, the crowd truly saw him, not just the worn clothes or the tired eyes, but the man beneath it all. Connection and call to action. Hi everyone, and welcome. Tonight, I'm sharing a story that's not just about one man's journey, but about something deeper, something we all need to be reminded of. It's about humanity, about love, and about how a single act of kindness can change the trajectory of someone's life forever. If you've ever felt invisible, overlooked, or underestimated, this story is for you. And if you've ever had the power to lift someone else, even in the smallest way, it's a call to action. Stay with us as we uncover a tale that will remind you of the beauty of compassion and the incredible strength it takes to keep going. Let's dive in. The bustling streets of Charleston, South Carolina, painted a picturesque scene under the golden hues of twilight. In the heart of the city stood Magnolia Haven, a high-end restaurant known for its elegant ambiance and impeccable service. Inside, the soft hum of jazz blended with the clinking of glasses and murmured conversations, creating an air of sophistication that seemed almost untouchable. At the helm of it all was Victoria Harper, a striking woman in her early 40s. Her polished demeanor and sharp business acumen had earned her a reputation as a capable manager. Yet behind her poised exterior lay a woman deeply entrenched in her biases, convinced that appearances defined worth. Tonight was no ordinary evening. The restaurant was preparing for a highly anticipated guest, Gabriel Winston, a tech entrepreneur whose success story was as inspiring as it was intimidating. Victoria had spent weeks ensuring that every detail of the night was perfect, from the menu to the floral arrangements. Nothing, absolutely nothing, was to disrupt this carefully curated event. As waitstaff hurried to and fro, a subtle shift in the room's energy rippled through the air. The cause of this disturbance appeared in the form of Marcus Hayes, a man whose worn-out clothes and tired gait stood in stark contrast to the refined patrons of Magnolia Haven. Marcus, a black man in his late 40s, had the kind of presence that seemed to carry the weight of countless struggles. His once strong frame was now gaunt, and his deep-set eyes reflected a quiet resilience born from years of hardship. He hesitated at the threshold, aware of the stares burning into him. Marcus wasn't here to dine or disrupt. All he wanted was a glass of water and perhaps a moment of warmth before returning to the cold streets that had become his home. Victoria's sharp eyes locked onto Marcus as he stepped forward, his calloused hands resting on the edge of the hostess podium. She left the table she had been inspecting, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor as she approached. Her smile, calculated and tight, barely masked the irritation simmering beneath. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice carrying the saccharine edge of someone feigning politeness. "I believe you're in the wrong place." Marcus straightened slightly, his voice steady, yet tinged with exhaustion. "Ma'am, I'm just asking for a glass of water. I won't stay long." The request was simple, yet it sent a ripple of discomfort through the nearby patrons. Victoria's eyes narrowed, scanning Marcus from head to toe. To her, he was a blemish on the otherwise pristine image of Magnolia Haven. "We're not running a charity here," she replied, her tone cold and final. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Nearby, Caleb Reed, a young server with an unshakable sense of empathy, watched the scene unfold. His grip on the tray he was carrying tightened as he witnessed the interaction. Caleb had always believed in the fundamental goodness of people, but moments like this tested that belief. Marcus didn't argue. He simply nodded, a hint of sadness flickering across his face as he turned to leave. But Caleb couldn't let it go. As Marcus reached the door, Caleb slipped behind the bar, quickly filling a glass with water. Ignoring the disapproving looks from his co-workers, he hurried after Marcus. "Here," Caleb said, holding out the glass. "It's not much, but—" Before Marcus could accept, Victoria's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Caleb!" she snapped, her heels clicking ominously as she approached. The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward them. "What do you think you're doing?" Victoria hissed, her voice low but laced with fury. "This isn't some soup kitchen. You're here to serve paying customers, not play hero." Caleb's face flushed, but he didn't back down. "He's just asking for water," he said, his voice firm. "It's not hurting anyone." "It's hurting the reputation of this establishment," Victoria retorted, her words dripping with disdain. She turned to Marcus, her expression hardening further. "You need to leave. Now." The weight of her words hung heavily in the air. Marcus looked at Caleb, offering a faint smile of gratitude before stepping out into the night. Caleb stood frozen, a mix of anger and helplessness swirling within him as he watched Marcus disappear into the shadows. Marcus hadn't made it far when he was confronted by a group of teenagers lingering near the sidewalk. Their loud laughter and pointed stares made it clear that he was their target. "Hey, old man," one of them called out, stepping into Marcus's path. "Lost your way to the shelter?" The taunts came fast and cruel, each word cutting deeper than the last. Marcus kept his head down, trying to sidestep the group, but they closed in around him. One boy shoved him, sending him stumbling back into the cold brick wall of the restaurant. Inside, Caleb caught sight of the commotion through the large windows. His heart clenched as he saw Marcus cornered, but Victoria's icy glare reminded him of his place. He clenched his fists, torn between his instinct to intervene and his fear of jeopardizing his job. "Please," Marcus said softly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I don't want any trouble." The teenagers only laughed, their voices echoing in the quiet street. Marcus braced himself as another shove sent him sprawling to the ground, the rough pavement scraping against his palms. It wasn't until the roar of an engine and the glare of headlights cut through the scene that the boys froze. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, its imposing presence commanding immediate attention. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped Gabriel Winston, his tailored suit catching the glow of the streetlights. Gabriel's sharp eyes took in the scene, narrowing as they landed on Marcus sprawled on the ground. Without hesitation, he strode forward, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority. "What's going on here?" Gabriel asked, his tone leaving no room for argument. The teenagers exchanged nervous glances before muttering half-hearted apologies and scattering into the night. Gabriel crouched beside Marcus, offering a hand to help him up. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softening. Marcus hesitated before taking Gabriel's hand, his grip firm despite the tremble in his fingers. "I'm fine," he said quietly, though the weariness in his voice betrayed him. Gabriel studied him for a moment before straightening. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you inside." Marcus's eyes widened. "Inside? I don't think—" "You saved my life once," Gabriel interrupted, his tone resolute. "Let me return the favor." Gabriel Winston led Marcus Hayes through the doors of Magnolia Haven with an air of quiet authority. The restaurant, once bustling with conversation, fell into a stunned silence as every patron turned their gaze toward the unlikely pair. Gabriel's tailored suit and commanding presence stood in stark contrast to Marcus's weathered clothing and hesitant steps. At the sight of them, Victoria Harper froze. Her carefully composed demeanor wavered for a split second before she forced a tight smile back onto her face. She stepped forward, her heels clicking on the polished floor as she tried to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Winston," she began, her voice laced with an artificial warmth. "Welcome to Magnolia Haven. We've been expecting you." Gabriel didn't acknowledge her greeting. His focus remained on Marcus, whose unease was palpable. Gabriel guided him toward the VIP section, where a pristine table awaited. Victoria's smile faltered as she realized what he intended to do. "Mr. Winston," she said, lowering her voice as she hurried after them. "Perhaps I could arrange a more private setting for you?" Gabriel turned to face her, his expression calm but unyielding. "This table is fine." Victoria hesitated, glancing at Marcus with thinly veiled disdain. "I'm not sure if this individual would be comfortable in such a setting. Perhaps it's best if you do your job." Gabriel interrupted, his tone sharp enough to cut through her objections. The room seemed to hold its breath as Victoria stiffened, her face flushing with embarrassment. Caleb Reed, standing by the bar, suppressed a grin as he watched Victoria struggle to maintain her composure. He quickly grabbed a menu and approached the table, determined to make up for the earlier scene. "Good evening, Mr. Winston," Caleb said, his tone professional but warm. He glanced at Marcus and added, "And welcome, sir. Can I start you off with some water?" Gabriel nodded, giving Caleb an approving look. "Water would be great, thank you." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze darting around the room. He could feel the weight of the stares from the other patrons, their whispers prickling at the edges of his consciousness. Despite Gabriel's reassuring presence, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong. As Caleb brought their water, Gabriel leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes scanning the room. The murmurs among the patrons grew louder, some voices tinged with curiosity, others with indignation. Gabriel's expression remained calm, but there was a quiet intensity in his demeanor that commanded respect. "Drink up," Gabriel said, his voice breaking through Marcus's thoughts. "You look like you could use it." Marcus hesitated before taking a sip of the ice-cold water. It was a simple gesture, but the relief it brought was undeniable. For a moment, the noise around him faded, replaced by the cool clarity of the drink. "You don't have to do this," Marcus murmured, his voice barely audible. "I don't want to cause trouble." Gabriel leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You're not causing trouble, and I'm not doing this for charity, Marcus. I owe you." Before Marcus could respond, Victoria returned, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes betraying her frustration. "Mr. Winston, may I speak with you privately?" Gabriel didn't look away from Marcus as he replied, "Anything you need to say can be said here." Victoria's jaw tightened. She glanced around the room, her voice lowering. "With all due respect, Mr. Winston, this situation is unconventional. Some of our patrons are expressing concerns." "Let them," Gabriel said, cutting her off. He finally turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. "If your patrons are uncomfortable because I've invited a guest to dine with me, perhaps they should examine their own values." Victoria's carefully constructed facade began to crack. She opened her mouth to respond, but thought better of it, retreating with a curt nod. Gabriel watched her go before turning back to Marcus, his expression softening. "Don't let her get to you," Gabriel said. "She's just protecting what she thinks is important." Marcus met his gaze, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "And what do you think is important?" Gabriel's answer was simple but firm. "People." As the evening progressed, Gabriel made a point of engaging Marcus in conversation, drawing him out of his shell. At first, Marcus was reluctant, answering in short, guarded sentences. But Gabriel's patience and genuine interest began to chip away at his defenses. "So," Gabriel said, taking a sip of his wine, "how'd you end up in Charleston?" Marcus hesitated, his fingers tracing the edge of his glass. "I guess you could say I've been drifting, looking for a place to start over." Gabriel nodded thoughtfully. "Starting over isn't easy, but it's worth it." Before Marcus could respond, a voice from a nearby table interrupted. "Excuse me, but I don't think it's appropriate for him to be here." The room fell silent as the comment hung in the air. Gabriel's expression didn't change, but there was a noticeable tension in his posture as he turned toward the speaker. A middle-aged man in a tailored suit, his wife nodding in agreement beside him. "Do you have a problem with my guest?" Gabriel asked, his tone deceptively calm. The man hesitated, clearly not expecting to be confronted. "It's just, this is a fine dining establishment. I'm sure there are other places more suited to someone like him." Gabriel's smile didn't reach his eyes. "And what kind of place would that be?" The man faltered, his wife tugging at his sleeve as if to silence him. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, his gaze never wavering. "If you're uncomfortable, you're welcome to leave, but Marcus stays." The man didn't reply. He looked away, his face red with embarrassment, as the other patrons avoided his gaze. Caleb, who had been watching from a distance, felt a surge of pride as Gabriel once again stood up for Marcus. As the tension in the room began to dissipate, Marcus found himself relaxing for the first time in what felt like years. Gabriel's unwavering support and Caleb's kindness had chipped away at the walls he had built around himself. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly, his voice heavy with emotion. Gabriel smiled, raising his glass. To new beginnings. Marcus hesitated before raising his own glass, the gesture feeling both foreign and profoundly meaningful. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, things could change. The air inside Magnolia Haven was thick with tension as the evening continued. Marcus Hayes, still seated at the VIP table with Gabriel Winston, could feel the weight of every gaze in the room. Conversations were subdued, punctuated by furtive glances and whispered speculations. Despite Gabriel's commanding presence, the disapproval radiating from certain patrons was impossible to ignore. At a corner table near the window, a well-dressed couple whispered to one another, their eyes flitting toward Marcus like he was some unwelcome apparition. The woman clutched her wine glass, her lips pressed into a thin line. "This is supposed to be a high-class establishment," she muttered to her husband. "What is he even doing here?" Gabriel, ever perceptive, caught the remark. He didn't react immediately, choosing instead to focus on Marcus. "How's the water?" he asked, his tone casual, as though he hadn't just walked into a room simmering with judgment. Marcus hesitated, his hands cradling the glass like it was something precious. "It's good. Thank you." Gabriel smiled, but there was a sharpness in his eyes as he glanced around the room. He was no stranger to the subtle language of prejudice. Whispered words, sidelong glances, the tightening of shoulders when someone different entered their space. Tonight, however, he had no intention of letting it slide. Victoria Harper, who had retreated to the bar after her earlier confrontation with Gabriel, was observing the scene from afar. Her fingers drummed against the counter, her mind racing as she weighed her options. She prided herself on maintaining an impeccable reputation for Magnolia Haven, and this situation was threatening to unravel it. But Gabriel Winston wasn't just any guest. He was a man of influence, someone whose approval could make or break a business like hers. That left Victoria in a precarious position, torn between her personal biases and her professional ambitions. "Miss Harper," one of the waitstaff ventured hesitantly, interrupting her thoughts. "Some of the guests are expressing concerns about the man with Mr. Winston. Should we do something?" Victoria's lips thinned. She wanted to act. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to take control of the situation. Yet the memory of Gabriel's earlier words stopped her. "If your patrons are uncomfortable because I've invited a guest to dine with me, perhaps they should examine their own values." The humiliation still burned. She forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "No," she said tightly, "not yet." Meanwhile, the undercurrent of discontent among the patrons was becoming harder to ignore. At another table, a group of businessmen in crisp suits exchanged pointed looks. One of them leaned forward, his voice low but deliberately audible. "This is ridiculous. If they're going to let just anyone in, why bother dressing up?" The comment was met with quiet chuckles, but not everyone found it amusing. Caleb Reed, who had been refilling glasses at a nearby table, paused mid-pour. His jaw tightened as he fought the urge to respond. Caleb had grown up in a small, tight-knit community where kindness was valued above all else. Moments like this tested his patience and his faith in humanity. He glanced toward Marcus, who was speaking quietly with Gabriel. The older man's posture was hunched, his body language screaming discomfort despite Gabriel's efforts to include him. It was clear that Marcus felt out of place, like an uninvited guest at a party he hadn't meant to crash. Caleb's hands tightened around the pitcher he was holding. He couldn't stand by and watch this unfold without doing something. Steeling himself, he approached the VIP table, setting down a fresh basket of bread with a quiet, "Here you go." Marcus looked up, surprised. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft. "You're welcome," Caleb replied, his tone genuine. He hesitated for a moment before adding, "If you need anything else, just let me know." Gabriel's eyes met Caleb's, and he gave the young server a small nod of appreciation. It was a subtle exchange, but it bolstered Caleb's resolve. Maybe he couldn't change the minds of everyone in the room, but he could at least show Marcus that not everyone shared their narrow-minded views. The uneasy truce didn't last long. Moments later, one of the businessmen from the corner table rose to his feet. He approached the VIP section with measured steps, his expression carefully neutral, but his intentions clear. When he reached Gabriel and Marcus's table, he cleared his throat. "Mr. Winston," the man began, his tone dripping with feigned politeness. "I couldn't help but notice your guest. Forgive me." but I thought this establishment had certain standards. Gabriel set down his glass, his movements deliberate. He leaned back in his chair, fixing the man with a gaze so cold it could have frozen fire. And what standards would those be? The man faltered but quickly recovered, gesturing toward Marcus. Surely you understand? This is a fine dining restaurant. We all come here expecting a certain atmosphere. And you think Marcus is disrupting that atmosphere? Gabriel's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made the hairs on the back of Caleb's neck stand up. Well, the man said, his confidence wavering under Gabriel's stare. It's just unusual, isn't it? Someone like him in a place like this. Gabriel's smile was sharp enough to cut. Someone like him? You mean a man who served this country with honor? A man who's faced more challenges in a year than you've probably faced in your entire life? The man's face turned an uncomfortable shade of red. I didn't mean... You meant exactly what you said, Gabriel interrupted, his voice rising just enough to carry across the room. And I'll tell you what I think. If you're so uncomfortable being in the presence of someone like Marcus, perhaps you're the one who doesn't belong here. A ripple of shock ran through the restaurant. Caleb, standing a few feet away, had to fight the urge to cheer. The businessman sputtered something unintelligible before retreating to his table, his shoulders hunched in defeat. Gabriel watched him go, his expression unreadable. Turning back to Marcus, Gabriel's voice softened. You okay? Marcus nodded, though his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his glass. I'm fine. Gabriel didn't push. Instead, he raised his glass in a silent toast, a small gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes. The ripple of Gabriel Winston's words seemed to hang in the air, reverberating through the restaurant like the last echo of a thunderclap. Conversations that had simmered into awkward whispers stopped altogether, leaving a heavy silence in their place. Marcus Hayes remained seated at the VIP table, his shoulders slightly hunched under the weight of the scrutiny he could still feel pressing in from every corner of the room. Victoria Harper, who had been watching the confrontation unfold from the bar, clenched her fists tightly at her sides. This was spiraling out of control. Magnolia Haven had been her pride and joy for years, a testament to her hard work and meticulous attention to detail. Now, one man, two if she counted Gabriel, was threatening to upend everything she had built. Her jaw tightened as she made her way back to the VIP section. Mr. Winston, Victoria began, her voice carefully measured as she approached the table. I truly apologize if there has been any misunderstanding this evening. Gabriel didn't look up from his glass of wine. The only misunderstanding, he said coolly, is that some people here seem to think they're better than others. Victoria hesitated, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face before she masked it with her usual professionalism. I assure you, sir, that Magnolia Haven welcomes everyone, but I must also consider the comfort of all our patrons. And what makes you think Marcus is a threat to anyone's comfort? Gabriel asked, finally looking up. His gaze was piercing, cutting through her defenses like a blade. Victoria faltered, unprepared for the directness of his question. I simply mean that this is an upscale establishment, and our clientele have certain expectations. Let me stop you right there, Gabriel interrupted, his tone firm. If your clientele can't handle being in the presence of a man like Marcus, then perhaps their expectations need adjusting. Behind the bar, Caleb Reed's chest swelled with quiet pride. Gabriel was saying what Caleb had wanted to say all evening, but couldn't. It was a rare thing to witness someone so unapologetically stand up for what was right, especially in a place like this. Victoria's hands tightened around the edges of her clipboard as she struggled to maintain her composure. She had spent years cultivating a particular image for Magnolia Haven, and this was not it. Yet, Gabriel Winston was not a man she could afford to alienate. His influence extended far beyond this restaurant. One word from him could make or break her career. I understand your perspective, Victoria said finally, forcing a tight smile. But I must think of the long-term reputation of this establishment. Gabriel's eyes narrowed. And what reputation is that, exactly? One that excludes people based on how they look or what they've been through. Because if that's the case, it's not a reputation worth protecting. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Marcus spoke for the first time since the confrontation had begun. His voice was quiet but steady, carrying a weight that silenced even the most skeptical onlookers. "Ms. Harper," Marcus said, addressing her directly, "I don't want to cause trouble. If my presence here is going to create problems, I'll leave." Gabriel frowned, but Marcus held up a hand to stop him. "You've already done more for me than I could ever repay," Marcus said, his gaze steady. "I appreciate your kindness, but I've been dealing with people like this my whole life. I can handle it." The humility in Marcus's words struck something deep within Victoria, though she would never admit it. For a brief moment, she saw him not as a disruption, but as a man who had been through more than she could imagine, yet still carried himself with dignity. It was a fleeting realization, quickly buried beneath her instinct to protect her business. "I'm afraid I can't allow that," Gabriel said firmly. "You're my guest tonight, Marcus, and I won't let anyone push you out." As the tension reached its peak, Caleb stepped forward with a quiet determination. He approached the table, his hands steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. "Would you like to see the menu, sir?" Caleb asked, addressing Marcus with the same respect he showed every other guest. Marcus hesitated, his eyes searching Caleb's face for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, he nodded. "Sure," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Caleb handed him a menu, his movements precise but unhurried. It was a small gesture, but it carried an immense weight. By treating Marcus as any other guest, Caleb was making a statement, one that didn't need words to be understood. Gabriel smiled faintly, his respect for Caleb growing with each passing moment. Victoria, however, bristled. She couldn't reprimand Caleb without drawing more attention to herself, so she said nothing, though her displeasure was evident. As Marcus scanned the menu, a ripple of movement caught his eye. From a nearby table, a young girl, no older than 7, was staring at him with wide, curious eyes. Her parents, seemingly oblivious, were deep in conversation, their voices low but animated. The girl's gaze didn't waver as Marcus looked up. Slowly, she slid off her chair and walked over to the VIP section, clutching a piece of paper in her tiny hands. Caleb noticed her first and crouched down to meet her at eye level. "Hey there," Caleb said gently. "Can I help you?" The girl held out the paper, her small fingers trembling slightly. "It's for him," she said, pointing at Marcus. Caleb took the paper and handed it to Marcus, who unfolded it carefully. It was a drawing, simple, almost childlike, but unmistakably heartfelt. The image depicted a man standing tall beneath a bright sun, his arms outstretched as if embracing the light. Beneath the drawing, in shaky letters, were the words, "Be strong." Marcus's throat tightened as he stared at the drawing. He looked up at the girl, who was watching him with an expression of pure, unfiltered kindness. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The girl smiled and ran back to her table, leaving Marcus holding the paper like it was the most precious thing he had ever received. For the first time that evening, the tension in the room seemed to ease. The drawing, small and simple as it was, had shifted something intangible, a reminder that kindness, no matter how small, could ripple outward in ways no one could predict. The drawing in Marcus's hands felt like an anchor, grounding him in a moment that had otherwise been fraught with tension and discomfort. He traced the uneven lines with his fingertips, the words, "Be strong," echoing in his mind. For the first time in what felt like years, Marcus allowed himself to feel something other than weariness. Hope. Gabriel noticed the subtle change in Marcus's expression and smiled. "Looks like you've got a fan," he said, gesturing toward the young girl who was now back at her table, giggling with her parents. Marcus nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "She reminded me of my daughter," he said softly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Gabriel leaned forward, his interest piqued. "You have a daughter?" "Had," Marcus corrected, his voice tightening. "She passed away years ago. Car accident. My wife, too." Gabriel's expression softened, and the room seemed to fade into the background. For a moment, it was just the two of them, two men bound by an unspoken understanding of loss and resilience. "I'm sorry," Gabriel said quietly. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been." Marcus shrugged, though the gesture did little to hide the pain etched into his features. "You don't really get over something like that. You just learn to carry it." The honesty in Marcus's voice struck a chord in Gabriel. Here was a man who had endured more than most could fathom, yet he was still standing, still fighting in his own quiet way. It was a resilience that deserved recognition, not pity. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the restaurant was beginning to shift. The young girl's innocent gesture had sparked murmurs among the patrons, but this time, the tone was different. Instead of disdain or judgment, there was a growing sense of curiosity, even empathy. At a table near the bar, an older woman whispered to her companion, "Do you think he really lost his family? He looks so tired." Her companion nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Tired, yes, but there's something about him. Like he's been through hell and back, and he's still standing." Not everyone was swayed, of course. At the far end of the room, the businessman who had confronted Gabriel earlier was nursing his drink, his face set in a deep scowl. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to his wife, his voice loud enough to carry. "One man doesn't belong here," and suddenly the whole place goes soft. Victoria Harper, who had returned to the bar, heard the comment and winced. She was torn between her instincts to defend her establishment and the growing realization that Gabriel Winston's actions were resonating with more people than she had anticipated. Her carefully constructed world was shifting beneath her feet, and she wasn't sure how to regain control. "Ms. Harper," one of the waitstaff ventured hesitantly, breaking into her thoughts. "Some of the guests are asking about the man with Mr. Winston. Should we say anything?" Victoria hesitated, her mind racing. She could feel the room slipping out of her grasp, her authority undermined by a man she couldn't afford to alienate. Finally, she sighed, "Let them talk." At the VIP table, Gabriel decided it was time to share his own story. "You know," he began, swirling his glass of wine thoughtfully, "I wasn't always the man you see sitting here. A few years ago, I was in a car accident, bad one. Flipped my car on a mountain road. They said I was lucky to survive." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like someone upstairs was looking out for you." Gabriel smiled faintly. "Maybe, but it wasn't just luck. There was someone who pulled me out of that wreck. A stranger who didn't even wait around for a thank you. Just saved my life and disappeared." Marcus tilted his head, something in Gabriel's tone sparking a faint memory. "You think that was me?" "I know it was," Gabriel said, his gaze steady. "I'd recognize your voice anywhere." The revelation hit Marcus like a freight train. He remembered that night, pulling over on a deserted road, breaking the car window, and dragging an unconscious man to safety. He hadn't stayed long, just enough to make sure the man was breathing before disappearing into the shadows. He had never expected to see that man again, let alone in a setting like this. "I didn't think you'd remember," Marcus admitted, his voice tinged with disbelief. Gabriel laughed, a warm, genuine sound that seemed to lighten the weight in the room. "How could I forget? You saved my life, Marcus, and I've been looking for a way to repay you ever since." As Gabriel and Marcus's conversation deepened, the businessman at the far end of the room finally reached his breaking point. Slamming his glass onto the table, he stood up and marched toward the VIP section. His wife tried to stop him, but he brushed her off. "This has gone on long enough," the man declared, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. "I don't care who you are, Mr. Winston, but this man doesn't belong here. And frankly, neither do you if you insist on bringing people like him into a place like this." The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward the confrontation, the air crackling with tension. Gabriel stood slowly, his movements deliberate, his expression calm but dangerous. "People like him?" Gabriel repeated, his voice deceptively soft. "You mean a man who risked his life to save a stranger? A man who's faced more challenges in a year than you'll probably face in your entire life?" The businessman faltered, but Gabriel didn't let up. "If anyone here doesn't belong, it's someone who thinks their money or their status makes them better than others. So, if you have a problem with my guest, you're welcome to leave, but Marcus stays." The businessman's face flushed with embarrassment as murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. His wife tugged at his arm, whispering something urgent, but he shook her off and stormed out of the restaurant. The door closed behind him with a definitive thud, leaving the room buzzing with quiet energy. Marcus stared at Gabriel, a mix of awe and gratitude shining in his eyes. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "I'm not worth all this trouble." Gabriel's expression softened. "Don't sell yourself short, Marcus. You're worth more than you know." Caleb, who had been watching from a distance, stepped forward with a small smile. "Anything I can get you to?" he asked, breaking the tension with his easy manner. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. Maybe some coffee, it's been a while. Coming right up, Caleb said, his voice warm. As he walked away, he couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. Tonight was far from ordinary, but it was a night he would never forget. The air inside Magnolia Haven began to settle after the dramatic exit of the disgruntled businessman. Conversations resumed, though they were quieter, more reflective. The tension that had once dominated the room was now tempered with a mix of curiosity and cautious respect. At the VIP table, Marcus Hayes sat in stunned silence, his weathered hands still clutching the drawing the young girl had given him. The words, "be strong," seemed to take on new meaning after what had just transpired. Across from him, Gabriel Winston sat with an easy confidence, his sharp eyes scanning the room as if daring anyone else to challenge his guest's presence. "You okay?" Gabriel asked, breaking the silence between them. Marcus nodded slowly. "I'm not used to people sticking their necks out for me," he admitted. "It's strange." Gabriel leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful look crossing his face. "Well, maybe it's time that changed." From her position near the bar, Victoria Harper watched the scene unfold with a mixture of frustration and unease. She prided herself on her ability to maintain control, but tonight, the balance of power had shifted, and she wasn't sure how to regain her footing. Victoria's mind raced as she considered her options. Should she apologize to Marcus? Offer some sort of olive branch? The very thought made her stomach churn. She had spent years cultivating the image of Magnolia Haven as a place of exclusivity and sophistication. To openly align herself with a man like Marcus Hayes, a man who didn't fit into her carefully curated world, felt like a betrayal of everything she had worked for. And yet, she couldn't ignore the subtle shift in the room. The disdain that had once dominated the patron's expressions was now tempered by something else: curiosity, perhaps even respect. Gabriel Winston had done what Victoria had been unwilling to do. He had forced people to see Marcus as more than just a man down on his luck. He had made them see his humanity. Victoria's fingers tightened around her clipboard as she made a decision. She couldn't undo what had already happened, but she could salvage the evening. Taking a deep breath, she smoothed her expression into one of calm professionalism and made her way toward the VIP section. "Mr. Winston, Mr. Hayes," Victoria began, her tone carefully measured as she approached the table. "I hope you're enjoying your evening." Gabriel raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "It's been enlightening." Victoria forced a tight smile. "I wanted to personally apologize for any discomfort caused earlier. It was never my intention to make anyone feel unwelcome." Marcus looked up, surprised by the sudden shift in her demeanor. He searched her face for any sign of sincerity, but found it difficult to tell if her words were genuine or merely an attempt to save face. "I appreciate that," Gabriel said, his tone polite but distant. "But an apology means nothing if it doesn't come with a change in attitude." Victoria's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "You're absolutely right," she said, though the words felt like ash on her tongue. "If there's anything I can do to make your evening more comfortable, please don't hesitate to let me know." Gabriel held her gaze for a moment longer before nodding. "Thank you." As Victoria walked away, Marcus let out a low whistle. "Never thought I'd see the day." Gabriel chuckled. "It's amazing what a little perspective can do." The evening continued with a surprising sense of calm. The patrons, now more subdued, seemed to have come to terms with Marcus's presence. Some even offered polite nods as they passed the VIP table, a small but significant gesture of acknowledgement. Caleb Reed returned with a steaming cup of coffee for Marcus, placing it on the table with a smile. "Here you go, sir." Freshly brewed, Marcus wrapped his hands around the warm cup, savoring the simple comfort it provided. "Thanks, kid," he said, his voice tinged with gratitude. Caleb hesitated for a moment, then leaned in slightly. "You know, my dad always said that everyone has a story worth hearing. I'd like to hear yours someday." Marcus looked up, startled by the sincerity in Caleb's voice. "Maybe," he said after a moment. "But it's not a pretty story. Those are usually the ones worth telling," Caleb replied with a grin before walking away. Gabriel watched the exchange with quiet approval. "Seems like you've made an impression," he said, taking a sip of his wine. Marcus shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I think it's the other way around. As the evening wound down, a surprising thing happened. One by one, a few patrons approached Marcus, offering kind words or quiet apologies. An older woman placed a hand on his shoulder as she passed. "Thank you for your service," she said softly, her eyes brimming with tears. A young man in a crisp suit stopped by the table, his expression earnest. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I think it's incredible what you've been through." Marcus accepted their words with a quiet dignity, though each interaction left him feeling a little lighter. For so long, he had felt invisible, a ghost moving through a world that refused to see him. Tonight, for the first time in years, he felt seen. As the restaurant emptied out, Gabriel signaled for the check. "You ready to head out?" he asked Marcus. Marcus hesitated, looking around the now quiet dining room. "Yeah," he said finally. "But I've got one question." Gabriel tilted his head. "What's that?" "Why'd you do it?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but laced with curiosity. "You didn't have to stand up for me. Most people wouldn't." Gabriel smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "Because someone once told me that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. And because I owe you more than I could ever repay." Marcus considered his words, then nodded. "Well, I guess I owe you now." "Good," Gabriel said with a grin. "That means I get to keep paying it forward." As they left Magnolia Haven, Marcus stepped into the night with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. Gabriel walked beside him, a quiet promise of support and understanding. For the first time in a long time, Marcus allowed himself to believe that better days were possible. The restaurant was quieter now, the clinking of silverware against plates reduced to a faint hum as the final few patrons lingered over dessert and coffee. Marcus sat across from Gabriel, the once overwhelming scrutiny of the crowd fading into the background. For the first time in years, Marcus felt like he was truly present, not just existing on the periphery of the world. Gabriel leaned forward, his voice low but insistent. "I wasn't lying earlier when I said you saved my life, Marcus. That night on the mountain road. You were the reason I'm still here." Marcus frowned, his brow furrowing as he tried to summon the memory. It was years ago, a fleeting moment buried under the weight of countless other struggles. But as Gabriel described the scene, the overturned car, the shattered windshield, the smell of gasoline, the pieces began to fall into place. "You were unconscious," Marcus murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think you'd remember." Gabriel smiled faintly, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "You don't forget something like that. I was trapped and I couldn't move. I remember the sound of glass breaking, someone pulling me out. When I came to, the paramedics told me a man had saved me and disappeared before they arrived." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He hadn't stayed to be thanked or acknowledged. At the time, he'd barely had enough to keep himself going, let alone the strength to face the questions that would inevitably come. He had done what needed to be done and moved on as he always did. "You didn't have to do that," Gabriel continued, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "But you did, and I've spent years trying to figure out why someone who owed me nothing would risk their life to save mine." Marcus's gaze dropped to his hands, calloused and worn from years of hardship. "It wasn't about you," he said quietly. "It was about doing the right thing. You were in trouble, and I couldn't just walk away." Gabriel studied him for a moment, his respect for the man across from him deepening with every word. "That's exactly why you deserve more than this, Marcus. You've given so much, and the world's given you nothing in return." Marcus shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "The world doesn't owe me anything, Gabriel. I've made my peace with that." But Gabriel wasn't ready to let it go. "Maybe the world doesn't, but I do. You saved my life, and I'm not going to stand by while you keep fading into the background." For a moment, the two men sat in silence, the weight of their conversation hanging heavy in the air. Marcus's thoughts drifted back to the life he had before everything fell apart. Before the accident, before the streets became his only refuge, he thought of his wife's laugh, his daughter's smile, and the quiet joy of a life that felt impossibly distant now. "You said earlier that you've been through a lot," Gabriel said, breaking the silence. "I don't mean to pry, but what happened? How did you end up here?" Marcus hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. He had spent years burying his past, the memories too painful to confront. but something in Gabriel's tone, the genuine curiosity, the lack of judgment, made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he could finally let someone in. "I used to have a family," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning inside him. "A wife, a little girl. We lived a simple life, but it was a good one. I worked hard, and I loved them more than anything." Gabriel listened intently, his expression softening as Marcus's story unfolded. "It was a rainy night," Marcus continued, his voice growing quieter. "We were driving home from a family dinner when it happened. A truck ran a red light, hit us head on. I remember waking up in the hospital, the doctors telling me they didn't make it." Gabriel's chest tightened as Marcus's words sank in. He couldn't begin to imagine the depth of that kind of loss. "I tried to keep going," Marcus said, his eyes distant, "but every day felt like a battle I couldn't win. I lost my job, my home, everything that mattered. Eventually, I ended up on the streets, just trying to survive." For a moment, Marcus's voice faltered, and he took a deep breath to steady himself. "You start to disappear after a while," he said, his tone laced with quiet resignation. "People stop seeing you. They look right through you, like you're not even there. And after a while, you start to believe them." Gabriel reached across the table, placing a hand on Marcus's arm. It was a simple gesture, but it carried an unspoken promise. "You're not invisible anymore." "Marcus," Gabriel said, his voice filled with conviction, "you didn't deserve any of that. And you don't deserve to spend the rest of your life being overlooked. I see you. And I'm going to make damn sure the rest of the world sees you too." Marcus met Gabriel's gaze, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. For so long, he had carried his pain alone, convinced that no one could or would understand. But tonight, for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he wasn't as alone as he had thought. Marcus sat back in his chair, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the memories he had just unearthed. Gabriel watched him, giving him the space to breathe, to process. For someone who had spent years being overlooked, the act of being truly seen was both comforting and terrifying. Marcus wasn't sure he was ready for what came next. "You've carried all of that alone," Gabriel said, breaking the silence gently. "That's too much for any one person." Marcus shrugged, his eyes fixed on the empty plate in front of him. "You learn to carry it. You have to." Gabriel nodded, his expression contemplative. "But that doesn't mean you have to keep carrying it alone. Let someone else share the load for once." Marcus's instinct was to protest, to push Gabriel away like he had pushed everyone else away for so long. But there was something disarming about Gabriel's sincerity. He wasn't offering charity or pity. He was offering solidarity. And that was a rare thing. Before Marcus could respond, the faint chime of the restaurant door drew their attention. A new figure entered, a young man in his 20s, dressed sharply but with an air of hesitation. He scanned the room until his eyes landed on Gabriel and Marcus. With a nervous glance around, he approached their table. "Excuse me," the man began, his voice shaking slightly. I just wanted to say something." Gabriel tilted his head, intrigued. "Go ahead." The man took a deep breath, his gaze shifting between the two of them. "Earlier tonight, I was one of the people whispering about you," he said, addressing Marcus directly. "I judged you before I knew anything about you, and I wanted to say I'm sorry." Marcus blinked, taken aback. He wasn't used to apologies, let alone one so genuine. "You don't have to," he began, but the man shook his head. "No, I do," the man said firmly. "I was wrong. And after hearing what Mr. Winston said about you, I realized I've been wrong about a lot of things. So, thank you for making me see things differently." With that, the man turned and walked away, leaving Marcus speechless. Gabriel smiled faintly, the corner of his mouth lifting in satisfaction. "Looks like you've already started making an impact." Marcus shook his head, a quiet laugh escaping him. "I don't know what to say to that." "You don't have to say anything," Gabriel said. "Just let it sink in. You're not invisible anymore." The restaurant staff began clearing tables, signaling the end of the evening. Caleb Reed approached with a polite smile, his hands folded neatly in front of him. "Would either of you like anything else before we close up?" he asked. Gabriel shook his head. "I think we're good. Thanks, Caleb." Caleb nodded but lingered for a moment, his gaze settling on Marcus. "I just wanted to say, it's been an honor having you here tonight," he said earnestly. "I don't know your whole story, but I hope you'll come back. Marcus was caught off guard by the sincerity in Caleb's voice. He nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot." Caleb gave a small, encouraging smile before retreating to help the other staff. Marcus watched him go, a flicker of something unfamiliar sparking in his chest. Hope, maybe, or something close to it. As the last of the patrons filtered out, Gabriel stood and stretched, gesturing for Marcus to follow. "Come on," he said. "Let's get out of here." Marcus hesitated, glancing around the now empty restaurant. For a brief moment, he wondered if any of this had been real. The kind words, the unexpected support, they felt like something out of a dream. But the warmth in Gabriel's voice and the weight of the drawing still tucked in his pocket grounded him in the reality of the moment. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of salt from the nearby harbor. Marcus shoved his hands into his pockets, unsure of what to say or how to express the gratitude he felt. Gabriel seemed to sense this and broke the silence for him. "I meant what I said earlier," Gabriel said as they walked down the quiet street. "I'm not just going to let you fade away, Marcus. You've done enough for the world. It's time someone did something for you." Marcus stopped, his footsteps faltering. He turned to face Gabriel, his expression a mixture of disbelief and vulnerability. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why do you care so much?" Gabriel met his gaze without hesitation. "Because someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it. And because the world needs more people like you, Marcus. People who remind us of what it means to be human." The words hit Marcus harder than he expected. For so long, he had felt like a shadow, drifting through life without purpose or direction. But tonight, for the first time in years, he felt like he mattered. And that was a feeling he wasn't ready to let go of. As they reached the corner, Gabriel placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "I've got a spare room at my place," he said casually, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "You're welcome to stay there as long as you need." Marcus hesitated, the offer both tempting and overwhelming. He had grown so used to surviving on his own that the idea of accepting help felt foreign, almost impossible. But then he thought of the drawing in his pocket, the words scrawled in a child's hand. "Be strong." "Okay," Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Gabriel smiled, his grip on Marcus's shoulder tightening briefly in reassurance. "You don't have to thank me. Just get some rest. Tomorrow's a new day." As they walked off into the night, Marcus felt a small but undeniable shift within himself. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't walking it alone. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Magnolia Haven, casting warm, golden hues across the pristine dining room. The restaurant was still, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night. Marcus stood in the center of the room, his gaze sweeping over the familiar yet foreign space. The silence was heavy, but not unwelcome. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of possibility, as fragile as it was profound. Gabriel entered, his presence as commanding as ever, but today, his expression was softer, more reflective. He carried 2 steaming cups of coffee, handing one to Marcus without a word. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of their shared understanding. "Did you sleep?" Gabriel asked, breaking the silence. Marcus nodded, though the night had been restless. The bed in Gabriel's guest room was the first real bed he'd slept in for years, and its comfort had been both a blessing and a reminder of how much he had lost. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It's been a while since I've had a roof over my head." Gabriel nodded, leaning against the bar. "Get used to it. That's not going to change anytime soon." Marcus chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You don't have to do all this, you know." Gabriel's expression turned serious. "I want to, and not just for you. Last night opened a lot of people's eyes, including mine. It made me realize that I've been part of the problem. I've been too comfortable in my own world, not looking beyond it. That changes now." Before Marcus could respond, the restaurant door opened, and Victoria Harper stepped inside. She hesitated in the doorway, her usual composed demeanor faltering as she spotted Marcus and Gabriel. Clutching her clipboard like a shield, she made her way toward them. "Good morning," she said, her voice carefully measured. "I didn't expect to see you here so early." Gabriel raised an eyebrow. "I could say the same about you." Victoria cleared her throat, shifting uncomfortably under his gaze. "I wanted to check in after last night. Make sure everything was in order." Marcus said nothing, watching the exchange with quiet curiosity. There was something different about Victoria today. A hesitation in her movements, a softness in her tone that hadn't been there before. "I also wanted to speak with you," she continued, her eyes flicking to Marcus briefly before settling on Gabriel. "About some changes I've been considering." Gabriel gestured for her to continue, his expression unreadable. Victoria took a deep breath, her grip on the clipboard tightening. "Last night was a wake-up call for me," she admitted. "I've spent years running this place with a very narrow view of what it should be. But seeing how the staff and the patrons reacted to Mr. Hayes made me realize that maybe it's time for a different approach." Marcus raised an eyebrow, surprised to hear his name spoken without a hint of disdain. Gabriel, too, looked intrigued, but remained silent, letting Victoria find her footing. "I'd like to organize a community outreach event," she said, her voice growing steadier. "Something to support people like Mr. Hayes, people who've been overlooked or forgotten. I think Magnolia Haven could be more than just a restaurant. It could be a place where people come together." Gabriel's expression softened, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's a good idea," he said simply. Victoria turned to Marcus, her gaze tentative but genuine. "And if you're willing, Mr. Hayes, I'd like to invite you to be part of it. Your story. It's powerful. I think it could inspire a lot of people." Marcus blinked, caught off guard by the offer. He searched her face for any sign of insincerity, but found none. "I don't know," he said finally. "I'm not really the kind of guy people look up to." "That's where you're wrong," Gabriel interjected, his voice firm. "You've been through more than most people can imagine, and you're still standing. That makes you someone worth listening to." Victoria nodded, her agreement evident in the way her shoulders relaxed. "You don't have to decide right now," she said, "but if you're open to it, I think it could make a real difference." Marcus hesitated, his instincts urging him to retreat, to avoid the spotlight that had so often brought him pain. But then he thought of the little girl's drawing, the words scrawled in shaky letters. "Be strong." Maybe it was time to try. "I'll think about it," he said quietly. Victoria smiled, relief flickering across her face. "That's all I ask." As the conversation wound down, Marcus felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. The world hadn't changed overnight, but something inside him had shifted. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. Gabriel clapped a hand on his shoulder as they watched Victoria leave. "You're doing good, Marcus," he said, "whether you realize it or not." Marcus looked at him, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Guess we'll see." The following weeks at Magnolia Haven unfolded in ways Marcus could never have imagined. The restaurant had transformed from a haven of exclusivity into a symbol of connection and community. At Gabriel's suggestion, Victoria announced the first of many community outreach events, a dinner night dedicated to serving those who had fallen on hard times, much like Marcus once had. The idea was met with mixed reactions initially, but as the event took shape, it became clear that this was more than just a gesture. It was the start of something bigger. On the night of the event, the restaurant buzzed with a different kind of energy. The tables were set with the same attention to detail as any high-profile evening, but the guests this time were a mix of families struggling to make ends meet, veterans trying to reintegrate into society, and individuals who had long been overlooked by the world around them. Marcus stood near the entrance, dressed in a crisp shirt Gabriel had insisted he wear. His hands fidgeted nervously as he watched people filter in. For years, he had been the one on the outside, looking in. Now, he was part of the effort to bring others inside, and the weight of that responsibility both humbled and terrified him. "You ready?" Gabriel's voice broke through his thoughts. Marcus turned to see Gabriel standing beside him, a reassuring smile on his face. "Not really," Marcus admitted. "What if I say the wrong thing? What if no one wants to hear it?" Gabriel chuckled softly, clapping a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You're overthinking it? Just tell your story. Be yourself. That's more than enough." Marcus nodded, though his nerves didn't fully abate. Gabriel's confidence in him was both comforting and daunting, but he knew Gabriel wouldn't let him back out now. As the room filled, Victoria took the stage at the front of the restaurant. Her usual polished demeanor was intact, but there was a warmth in her voice that hadn't been there before. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "Tonight is about more than just a meal. It's about community. It's about recognizing that every person in this room matters, and that every story deserves to be heard. Her eyes found Marcus in the crowd, and she smiled. With that in mind, I'd like to introduce someone whose story has already inspired so many of us. Please welcome Mr. Marcus Hayes. The room erupted into polite applause as Marcus made his way to the stage, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt every pair of eyes on him, and for a moment, he considered turning back. But then he thought of the little girl's drawing, the words that had become a mantra for him. Be strong. Taking a deep breath, Marcus stepped up to the microphone. I'm not used to speaking in front of people, he began, his voice trembling slightly. Most of my life, I've been the guy no one notices, and for a long time, I thought that's all I'd ever be. The room was silent, every face turned toward him, waiting. I've been through a lot, Marcus continued. I lost my family in a car accident. I lost my home. I lost myself for a while. And when you lose that much, it's easy to start believing that maybe you don't matter, that maybe the world is better off without you. A murmur rippled through the crowd, the weight of his words settling over them. But then something happened, Marcus said, his voice growing steadier. Someone saw me. Someone reminded me that I'm more than my circumstances. And that changed everything. His eyes found Gabriel in the crowd, and he nodded slightly. I'm here tonight because of that person, because they refused to let me disappear. And I want to do the same for anyone else who's ever felt invisible, because no one should feel like they don't matter. No one. The room erupted into applause, louder this time, filled with genuine admiration. Marcus stepped back from the microphone, his chest heaving as he tried to process the moment. For the first time in years, he felt like his voice had been heard. As the night wore on, Marcus moved through the crowd, speaking with guests, sharing stories, and listening to theirs. For many, it was the first time they had felt seen, the first time someone had cared enough to ask about their journey. And Marcus, with his quiet strength and unwavering empathy, was the perfect person to make them feel valued. Victoria watched from a distance, a mixture of pride and humility washing over her. She had spent so many years building walls around herself and her business, convinced that exclusivity was the key to success. But tonight, she saw the power of openness, of connection. And it was all because of a man she had once dismissed without a second thought. Gabriel joined her, a satisfied smile on his face. Not bad, huh? He said, gesturing toward Marcus, who was deep in conversation with a young woman and her son. Not bad at all, Victoria admitted. He's remarkable, Gabriel nodded. Told you. By the end of the evening, Marcus was exhausted but deeply fulfilled. As the last guest trickled out, he found himself standing alone in the now empty restaurant, the echoes of laughter and conversation still lingering in the air. Gabriel approached, a look of quiet pride on his face. You did good tonight, Gabriel said. Marcus smiled, his expression soft but genuine. So did you. Gabriel clapped a hand on his shoulder. This is just the beginning, Marcus. You've got a lot more to give, and the world's finally ready to see it. For the first time, Marcus believed him. As he stepped out into the cool night air, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he no longer felt like he was walking it alone. He was part of something bigger now, something meaningful. And for the first time in a long time, he was ready to embrace it. The dim glow of the streetlights bathed Magnolia Haven in a warm, golden light as Marcus stood outside, his breath visible in the cool night air. The evening's events played over in his mind like a film, each moment etched with a clarity that felt surreal. He had spoken, and people had listened, not just to the words he shared, but to the pain, the hope, and the humanity woven into his story. For the first time in years, Marcus felt like he belonged. Gabriel joined him, hands in his pockets, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. You know, Marcus, he began, his voice carrying a calm certainty. What you did tonight, it's bigger than you realize. You didn't just share your story. You gave people a reason to believe in something better. Marcus tilted his head, his gaze distant as he processed Gabriel's words. I didn't do anything special, he said softly. I just told the truth. And that's exactly what makes it special, Gabriel replied. Most people go through life afraid to be vulnerable, to admit they need help, or to show kindness without expecting something in return. You've reminded them that strength doesn't come from hiding your struggles. It comes from owning them. The words settled over Marcus, their weight both humbling and uplifting. He thought about the little girl's drawing, now carefully folded in his pocket, and the simple but profound message it carried. Be strong. It wasn't about pretending to be unbreakable. It was about finding strength and connection, in allowing others to lift you when you couldn't stand on your own. As they stood there, the door to the restaurant opened and Victoria Harper stepped out. Her usual composed demeanor had softened, replaced by a quiet vulnerability. She looked at Marcus, her lips curving into a tentative smile. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Not just for tonight, but for reminding me that this place can be more than just a business. It can be a home for people who need one." Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thank you for giving me a chance to show that." Victoria hesitated, then extended her hand. Marcus took it, their handshake a silent truce, a promise of change. As the three of them stood together, the night felt different, lighter somehow. It wasn't just the success of the evening that brought this sense of peace. It was the understanding that they had all, in their own way, chosen to believe in something better. They had chosen love, compassion, and connection over fear and judgment. The story of Marcus Hayes became more than just an inspiration. It became a reminder that every person, no matter how invisible they may feel, carries a spark of value and a story worth hearing. His journey from the shadows to the forefront of a community's heart was a testament to the power of kindness and the impact of seeing someone, not just for where they are, but for who they could be. The message was clear. Strength is not about standing alone. It's about allowing yourself to be lifted and, in turn, lifting others. And as Marcus walked into the night, his head held high, he knew that his story was far from over. It was just the beginning. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and open the mind. Until next time, remember, every story has the power to make a difference, yours included.